Hello, everyone, and welcome this week to the Grace Alone podcast. I know we've been out for a bit, but it's good to be back. And today we have a special guest, Pastor Jonathan Burris. Would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Jonathan Burris. I pastor Sophia Baptist Church in Sophia, North Carolina, and I am excited to be here today.
All right, awesome. So, obviously, with all our guests, we try to get them to tell how God miraculously saved them. So that's what we're going to start with today, as always. How did God save you, Jonathan?
Wow, and you used a fantastic word, miraculous. Um, In May of 1994, so 30 years ago this year, I a few weeks after I turned 16, I grew up around church, not really in church. My mother's side of the family, my grandfather was a pastor. He pastored a couple small churches throughout his life, but really, I had uh, no real upbringing, just a familiarity of being there when I had to be there, or if I went with my cousin and we spent the weekend together, I would have to go to church with his mom when they made, when I spent the night with him or something like that. But in May of 1994, I was in such a low place. I hated myself. I was afraid to die, but I didn't want to live. I was called trash every single day of my life by some of my own family. And I remember standing outside and looking up towards the heavens. I was no atheist. I knew there was a God and I hated him. And I looked up towards the heavens a week, just a few days before I got saved. And I remember screaming at God and telling him that I hated him. I hated my life. I blamed him for everything in my life. Um, and then that Friday, I just turned 16. I went to my mom's for the weekend, and the first thing she tells me when I get there is, "Hey, we're going to church on Sunday. All right, guys, y'all have a good time. I'll see you when you get back, or I'm going to go ahead and leave. I'll head back to my dad's, and I'll see you next time." No, 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 no. You can go home after we go to church. So I tried to weasel my way out of that all weekend. I just did not want to go, and I finally they convinced me I was going to go. And so, all right, well, if I'm going under protest. I'm going to drive separate, and I'm going to make sure that I'm leaving as soon as it's over. And on the way, I had a plan. I had a wonderful plan that I had concocted. I'd been in church services enough to know that usually around the end of the service, the pastor's going to ask everybody to stand, close their eyes, and man, I was darting out at that time. I was gone. So on the way, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that when I came in, I did not want to be there. They didn't want me there. I wanted to make sure that they didn't want me there. So I leaned over in my '87 Plymouth Duster and rolled down the passenger window before I turned right onto the road that the church was on, and I turned my radio up just as loud as it would go, listening to music with explicit lyrics. And I pulled into the parking lot like that, and it's blasting my eardrums, but I didn't care. I wanted to make sure that I was a nuisance and that they knew that trouble was walking in the door. I backed into my parking spot in the grass and gravel parking lot that day. I got out. My mom's just looking at me like, "I can't believe you just did that." We walk in, and my mom, my stepdad, my brother, they're trying to push me in the aisle. I was like, "No, no, 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 it's okay. You go in, and I'm gonna sit on the outside. I'm gonna sit on with I'm gonna sit near the aisle." That was my plan, and I sat the whole service with my foot hanging out in the aisle. And uh, just I remember the pastor getting up, and the first thing I thought about when I saw him was, somebody get this guy a sandwich. He was so skinny. He was an older gentleman, and I knew nothing about him, but I hated him because of what he was about to say. And here's the way that I'll explain it. Somewhere during that service, two things happened. I began to hate the sin that I loved, and I began to love the God that I hated. And sure enough, just like I expected, the pastor did what I knew he would. Little independent Baptist church, he asked everybody to stand and bow your heads, close your eyes. I'm going to give a decisional invitation. And uh, my foot betrayed me. Instead of turning to walk out the door as I had planned, I ran to the altar, and I was gloriously converted. I went home that day not fully able to comprehend everything, but I knew that there had been a change. As a matter of fact, my family over the next few days actually considered having me committed, thinking that I had been brainwashed because before, just a few days before, I could literally not go 5 minutes without some of the worst cuss words you will ever hear anyone say. And they went a couple days and they never heard me say anything harsh. I didn't bite anybody's head off. I didn't get into a fight. I didn't get into any trouble. And it was just an amazing change. And it's not something I did. It's what he did in me, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. And for 30 years now, he has been my master. And I have dedicated my life to serving him because of what he has done for me. But even if he hadn't done that, he's still worthy to be worshiped and praised as who he is.
That's such an amazing testament of how God can take someone so not for him and make him for him. What an amazing testimony of God's faithfulness. Um, so let's jump right into the topic at hand. As some of you know, some of you don't. Today's topic is what some would call the King James only controversy. Others, would call it a movement. Um, I grew up from time of birth in that world, in that movement. I know that you personally have been a part of it or been inside of that for a very long time. Um, and a question that I received from someone who knew that we were doing this particular topic is, what kind of is the history of this? Like, why is it so prevalent in the IFB context? I know there are other denominations like the Pentecostals and stuff who would also be considered King James only, but in this particular context, sticking with the King James only movement in the fundamentalist world, um, kind of how did that start? Like, what is the real like history of it?
There are various histories and some of it is a little foggy. Some of it there's some that goes back to the late 1800s, the 1890s, and some textual absolutism around the King James version back during that time. But really, it's not until we start to see the ASV in the early 1900s come along, and there starts to be some pushback with that. Then, as we get into you started to have a greater acceptance of the RSV, but it's not until you get into the fundamentalist movement and the independent fundamentalist Baptist movement of the 60s that it begins to become prominent, that it really begins to grow. And the 60s, the 70s, and you start to have during that time period, you start to have the hardcore fundamentalists that start to pull and pressure some of the others who really are not that rigid on Bible versions. For example, you have men like, oh my goodness, what is his name? Oh man, my mind just went blank. Sword of the Lord, John R. Rice. You had John R. Rice who would advertise on some nights for his meetings. Come tonight, bring your Catholic friends, and I'm going to preach the gospel from a Catholic Bible. There were times he would use an ASV, and over time he would get more and more pressure from people like Jack Hyles. And there was that division there. Harold Sightler, Lester Roloffs, those guys that really started to pull the rest of, I'll say, fundamentalism towards King James onlyism, to where that became another fundamental. So the fundamentals began to grow and grow, and this becomes a hardcore fundamental that if you do not hold to this, we're not talking about the basic fundamentals of the faith. Now we're talking about things that are truly extra biblical, or turning the Bible itself, a translation, into a translational or into a fundamentalist issue. And there was so much division, and over time, really, it became it just became the point where if you want to be in this group, if you're going to fellowship, if you're going to identify with this movement, then you're going to have to come this way. And when you have I'll say the grandfathers of that movement pulling in that direction, the groundswell was pretty big, and it didn't take it long for the more reasonable voices to get drowned out or to even get pushed out. And that's not a full history. There's a lot that goes on in the 1920s and the 1930s. But as far as the independent fundamentalist Baptist movement, it really does go back to the men that I was mentioning just a moment ago and the pressure that they put on others.
Right. Um, so just to kind of, so they say that um, there are four different ways that people will argue this view, or there are four different types of King James only, as they say. And if there are more, correct me. I I thought it would be helpful for people to go through uh, the different types and maybe even break it down and perhaps explain why those views perhaps aren't the most helpful. And of course, I think the first one that everyone goes to is the textual variance and the criticism of that. And th those particular arguments, that's always usually said to be the first. So like people arguing between can we only trust the TR or can we trust the text from Alexandria? And um let's kind of go into that a little bit. Like why are people skeptical of one text over the other?
Well, I think largely it's tradition. I mean, for example, it's what I grew up in. I grew up, and that's all I heard. It's really all I knew. I was raised that the King James version is all I ever heard in church, and then and as I grew, I began to hear that not only was it what I heard in church, but it's all that I should hear in church. And you start to hear statements like, everything that's bad comes from Alexandria. There's nothing good that ever came out of Egypt. I mean, you talk about some of the flaws of that, except for Jesus, the Israelites, and so on and so forth. There's so many things that did come out of Egypt that God used. But that doesn't matter when you're talking about textual absolutism. You bring up a very good point, and that is that there is a difference between some King James onlyists who are not open to any textual criticism whatsoever, and those who will actually look at other translations, look at manuscripts. So I have no problem with anyone who uses the King James version, who has a preference and who looks at the evidence and says, okay, I look at this, I look at these variants, I think this variant should be here. Okay, but that's usually not the conversation that you have, especially with what you just brought up. There's generally just the idea of anything coming out of Alexandria. Alexandria is just a pejorative. The whole notion concept of the TR versus Alexandria, but really that's not accurate. It really is more, if we're going to have a division, it's the Byzantine line of manuscripts, of which we have over 5,000 representatives, either large portions of manuscripts down to fragments. But when you consider those and compare those against both the Textus Receptus and against the so-called Alexandrian manuscripts, you'll find that when you compare those Byzantine manuscripts to the TR, you're going to find that there's around a 1.2% difference between the TR and the Byzantine majority, if you will. And if you compare the Byzantine majority to the Alexandrian manuscripts, you're going to end up with about a 1.8% difference. But when you consider that in that 1.8% difference is the longer ending of Mark and the pericope adultery, or the woman taken in adultery, John 7:53 through 8:11, and you pull that out, well, now you're back down to almost a 1.2% difference like you have between the Byzantine majority and the TR. So also, studies are showing today, and this information is just starting to come out, that now that we have the capabilities of doing data science on manuscripts and those types of things, that really the Alexandrian manuscripts, or really the Alexandrian text type, is not really such a thing. That it really is part of the Byzantine tradition. There really is just one tradition, the Byzantine tradition. And yes, there are differences. There are things that are common in the families of the Alexandrian text, such as nomina sacra, shorter wording, those types of things, where you may have Jesus versus the Lord Jesus Christ in Byzantine manuscripts, but largely they are similar. In fact, what I think is wonderful is when you start looking at the Alexandrian manuscripts, or so-called Alexandrian manuscripts, when you start looking at some of these codices and you start going through them, you'll find that, well, the Gospels may be Alexandrian, but the epistles will be Byzantine or vice versa. And so the entire argument begins to collapse on itself when people begin to look at the facts and the details of it.
Right. Um, so um, before we get into some of the other views, because a lot of, I think they say that one of the views is just King James preferred, which of
Mm-hmm.
course I don't um, see. I don't see an issue with. I'm not there, but I understand if that's what you grew up with and things like that. But before we get into what I would consider the most extreme view, um, another question that's also come up that a lot of people have had, and I've always failed to answer, I see if you can shed some light on it, is in most of your King James only churches now, they will say that, God's perfect word of 1611. Now, I can't speak for every dogmatic IFB church. The ones that I grew up in, they use the King James 1900, which is hundreds of years past 1611. And so, how do you think they do that by saying that something's perfect in 1611 and yet there's multiple different types of that, and how can you shed light on that? Like how could they say this is perfect, but they're not even using what they're saying as perfect?
That's an excellent question. And I don't want to sound rude, but it's based on ignorance. And ignorance is not stupidity. Ignorance is an absence of knowledge or a lack of knowledge. And you'll read in churches, in some IFB churches, in their statement of faith, they'll say that we only use the authorized version 1611. But as you said, what they're using is not an authorized version 1611. I have one. Matter of fact, I'm doing a series for the last two Sundays and this coming Sunday at a church on Sunday evenings uh, for a pastor friend of mine, and we're doing a series on how we know we can trust our Bibles. And last week I brought a 1611, a facsimile of the 1611, and it talked about some of the things that are in that are not in the 1900 Cambridge, that are not in the 1769 Blaney revisions, that are not and people don't know that sitting in the pew, the people who are in King James only churches and the people who are, if everyone in there is using a King James Bible, most likely no one has a 1611. Most likely, some people will have a 1900 Cambridge. Some people will have a 1769 Blaney. Some people are Oxford edition, and some will have a 1769 Cambridge edition, not knowing that there are real differences between all three of those translations. And that if they went through, and if you're going to argue that every single word, every jot or every yod and every tittle, every mark on the edge of a Hebrew letter is perfect and there can be no differences, then we have a huge problem, because just within the King James versions that they have within their churches, they're not the same. And I did this on a video a while back. I pulled out a Scofield Bible, and I pulled out some other King James, just I think 6 or 7 King James Bibles that I had, and opened them up and showed that they all read differently. They don't match. And that's a real issue, but it's one that's based on ignorance. And when you start bringing it up, well, okay, I'm going to pass that off as a printer error. But wait a minute. If you are going to claim, and if you're going to trust that God perfectly preserved every single word in translation, then why would he not also preserve it through printers? I mean, why would we say, well, we have it, but there's printer errors? Either their argument stands on the merits of the argument or it doesn't. And I argue that it doesn't.
Right. Um, that that's such that's such a great answer because that question has come up a lot, especially in those circles. People who are against it and even for it have those questions. And so the view that I'd like to tackle, the last view, is what I believe is the most extreme view, the Ruckmanite view, that position. Um, Before we get there, would you say that there is a difference, because some people believe there is, between the Sam Gipp, the new IFB, kind of Stephen Anderson stream of King James onlyism, which say that it doesn't correct the Greek necessarily, but it corrects the new Greek, just not the old, versus what Peter Ruckman was espousing in his view. Would you say there's a slight change or difference between that?
I would absolutely tell you that the new IFB, Stephen Anderson and his acolytes, they are not Ruckmanites. They reject Peter Ruckman and his teachings of double inspiration or re-inspiration. Sam Gipp I definitely wouldn't put Sam Gipp in the new IFB corner. He is more along the lines of the Ruckmanite position. According to him, all matters of translation were ended in 1611. That's a statement directly from him. You can find that from a recording of the John Ankelberg show from years and years ago with he and a representative from, I think it was the New King James. James White was there. The editor of the NASB. There were Doug Wilkins. There was a whole group of people there, and he made that statement there that. So I would definitely put Sam Gipp closer to the Ruckmanite position. I don't know that I would call him a Ruckmanite, but yes, the new IFB, Stephen Anderson and those guys definitely reject that. But you'll find that when hardcore King James only guys, even those that reject Ruckmanism, when they start having to defend their position, they sure start to sound like Ruckmanites. Even though they deny it, even though they reject it, their arguments get closer and closer to Ruckman. And I made this statement that a Ruckmanite is the only somewhat logical argument for King James only textual absolutism. Now, don't get me wrong, I do not think that Ruckmanism is a truly logical argument, but at least it is logically consistent within itself. That the only way you could claim that the King James Bible or the King James Version is a perfect translation would have to be double inspiration or re-inspiration. And the very notion that with Ruckman, they take it so far as to, and his followers take it so far as to say that, yes, this corrects the Greek or the Hebrew and I heard, I've seen that statement even within the King James Bible Research Council. Someone make that statement. They deny Ruckmanism, but yet make that statement that it can correct the Greek. Well, the only way you can have that is if you believe that you have something today that is better than what God originally gave. And if that is the case, then, as I said, you are now arguing something that is historically and factually inconsistent, ahistorical, and is truly illogical. Because if you have the Word of God today and you believe that it has been divinely preserved, but really, if you're talking about re-inspiration, it's no longer divine preservation. It is something new. It has new information. So you have words and a version that the original authors did not give you and that Christians did not have for the first 1,500 years of church history. And to make matters worse, that what you're looking at today is better than the original. And no copy, no translation could possibly be better than the original. And I know, well, we don't have the original. Well, let's be clear on that. We may not have the original parchment that those original words were written on, but we do have the original words.
Right. Right. Um, yeah, I think that was a great answer. What Ruckmanism is, and I've ran into a few of them in my day, and I felt like the best answer against Ruckmanism has been when someone maybe is convinced of his position on the King James Bible and they're watching. Um, I had one person I was talking to the other day who's been getting into Roy Bell and his
Mhm.
um, ministry. I've had other people who I've talked to who have gotten into Gene Kim and other people who are followers of Peter Ruckman. And my encouragement to people who have always gone into that is my concern with Ruckman. A big concern of it is the King James onlyism, but it's certainly not only that, right? Um, I think some would call it like hyper dispensationalism, or some would call it head acts, um, is a big issue. I think it is a, I think it doesn't get the gospel in itself right, even. And um, Pete, Pete, Peter Ruckman, just as a person, was not a moral man either. So I think that's one of the best ways to steer people away from Peter Ruckman is it's not only that, it's these other things as well that were stamped on his life.
And I think you bring up a good point, but some would argue, all right, well now you're committing ad hominem, you're attacking the man. But in reality, the reason why I think Ruckmanism is so dangerous is not, like you said, it is not because of the divisive King James onlyism. It is because of what his following his teaching leads to. And like you said, it leads to a hyper dispensationalism. And regardless of what your thoughts are on dispensationalism as a whole, hyper dispensationalism in the way that he teaches it, and that another group, mid-acts dispensationalists, that are very similar to their same this than Ruckman's hyper dispensationalist, you end up getting the gospel wrong, just like you said. And if you get the gospel wrong, then it doesn't matter what else you get right, because the gospel has got to be right. And what is so blasphemous to me, in my mind, is the very notion that Jesus preached and taught a faith plus works salvation. I cannot fathom how anyone clearly reading the scriptures, and I know they so focus on rightly dividing, and there is nothing rightly divided. It is, I use the term, they are wrongfully butchering the text when they present Christ as preaching a different gospel and put him at odds with the apostle Paul. According to Paul, Jesus is a curse. Jesus is anathema. Jesus is, is a recipient of those woes. If you go back and look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I get this question all the time from my videos dealing with Breaker and Kim and their Ruckmanism, is how can you say that they preach the same gospel when Jesus hadn't been crucified yet? The ignorance of not knowing that there is a progressive gospel that is found firstly in Genesis 3:15, and that goes all throughout the scriptures, and that it is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And we know that from the word of God alone. But the sheer ignorance of the gospel itself is the most dangerous aspect.
Right. Right, absolutely. I think that really encapsulates all that as a whole for as people who are struggling with that to be able to think on some of those things. That's really all the time we have for today because my Zoom recording thing is telling me I'm running out of time. But it was great to be able to have you on. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, sir. It's been a pleasure.
And Grace Alone, I will see y'all next week. Bye.